There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't always look like loneliness. It's quiet, invisible. It hides behind productivity, behind polite smiles, behind the phrase, "I'm just busy lately." But deep down, there's an ache that never quite goes away. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone. It's the loneliness of realizing that no one really knows you. You go to work. You have conversations. You might even laugh with colleagues. But when the day ends, your phone stays silent. No one texts to check in. No one calls just to talk. And you tell yourself it doesn't matter. You tell yourself you're fine with your own company. But then the weekend comes. Everyone else seems to have plans. Dinners, gatherings, inside jokes you're not part of. And you sit there wondering when it happened. When did the gap between you and everyone else become so wide? You're not antisocial. You're not cold. You notice everything. The shift in someone's tone, the awkward pause, the moment when conversation feels forced. You see when people are being polite versus actually interested. And over time, that awareness becomes a kind of cage, because the more you notice, the harder it becomes to relax. The harder it becomes to just be. Maybe you've tried. Maybe you've shown up to events, joined groups, put yourself out there. But nothing stuck. Conversations felt shallow. Connections felt temporary. And eventually you stopped trying. Not because you wanted to be alone, but because trying and failing hurt more than not trying at all. If this sounds familiar, if you've ever felt this particular kind of invisible, please know this. You're not broken. You're not defective. Something else is happening here. Something deeper than what people see from the outside. People often assume that those who have no friends are cold, antisocial, or uninterested in connection. But that's rarely the full truth. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes they care too deeply. They observe too much. They notice every micro shift in tone, every subtle change in energy. And that level of awareness makes casual friendship nearly impossible. Psychologists have found something fascinating. Dr. John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago discovered that prolonged social isolation actually changes how the brain processes social information. When you go too long without close bonds, your brain begins to interpret neutral social cues as threatening. A casual glance feels like judgment. A delayed text feels like rejection. Your nervous system treats isolation itself as danger, not because you're paranoid, but because for 200,000 years, being alone meant you wouldn't survive. What if the absence of friends isn't about being unlikable? What if it's about being deeply perceptive in a world that rewards surface-level connection? What if silence isn't emptiness? What if it's depth? Those who have no friends often make the best ones, if only someone would take the time to see them first. Because they know what it feels like to be unseen, they tend to see others more clearly. They notice what people don't say. They remember the small things. They don't take connection for granted because they know how rare it is. But here's what happens. That very depth, that careful observation, that refusal to perform, becomes the thing that keeps people at a distance. Because most social interaction isn't about depth, it's about ease. And ease requires a certain lightness, a certain willingness to glide across the surface without asking too many questions. When you can't do that, when you can't help but go deeper, you become exhausting to be around. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're asking something most people aren't ready to give. When you go too long without social bonds, something shifts. Your heart rate changes. Your sleep becomes lighter. Your mind starts scanning for danger in places where there isn't any. Not dramatically, quietly. You begin living in two realities, the one the world sees and the one you feel. On the outside, you're functioning, working, smiling when appropriate. But on the inside, there's a constant hum of vigilance. A part of you always watching, always evaluating, always wondering if you said the wrong thing. Social interaction becomes exhausting, not because you don't want connection, but because every interaction requires performance. You have to remember to make eye contact, but not too much. To laugh at jokes, even when they're not funny. To ask follow-up questions, even when you're drained. And afterward, you replay every moment. Did you talk too much? Not enough. Did that joke land wrong? Did they seem annoyed? The mental load becomes unbearable, so you start declining invitations. Not because you're antisocial, but because the cost of pretending to be easy and light and spontaneous is higher than the reward of shallow connection. And people notice. They stop asking. They assume you're not interested, and the gap widens. But here's what they don't see. The loneliness isn't about wanting more people. It's about wanting one person who gets it. One person you don't have to perform for. One person who sees through the surface and doesn't run away. Just one. But finding that feels impossible when every social interaction confirms that you're too much or not enough. This doesn't happen overnight. It starts small, usually in childhood. Maybe you shared something personal and someone laughed. Maybe you trusted someone with a secret and they used it against you. Maybe you tried to open up and felt misunderstood. Or maybe nothing dramatic happened at all. Maybe you were just different, quieter, more sensitive, more observant, and that difference was enough to make you feel like you didn't quite belong. Over time, this buries itself deep inside your nervous system. You learn that being yourself is risky, that authenticity invites judgment, that it's safer to keep people at a distance than to let them close enough to hurt you. And even now, in adulthood, that pattern persists. Not because you want it to, but because your brain is still protecting you from pain you experienced decades ago. Maybe you had a best friend once, someone who knew you completely, and then they left, moved away, grew apart, found other people, and the loss felt so overwhelming that some part of you decided never to let anyone that close again. Or maybe you never had that. Maybe you spent your whole childhood watching other kids form bonds that seemed effortless. Sleepovers, inside jokes, lunchroom tables you weren't invited to. And you told yourself it didn't matter. You told yourself you were fine alone. But children aren't fine alone. And the loneliness you felt then is still living inside you now, waiting for proof that this time will be different. But never quite believing it. Here's what neuroscientists discovered. Social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. When you replay a conversation where you felt stupid or judged, your brain processes it like you're actually getting hurt. Not metaphorically, actually. There's a concept in psychology called learned social helplessness. It's when you've tried to connect so many times and failed that you unconsciously stop trying altogether. Your brain associates reaching out with rejection. So even when you meet good people, later kind people, open people, your guard stays up. Because the pattern is already wired. This isn't weakness, it's emotional wiring. Your brain evolved in tribes of about 150 people. Everyone knew everyone. Isolation meant death. So your ancestors who felt social pain acutely, who desperately sought connection, survived. But now you live in a world with thousands of shallow connections and very few deep ones. Your brain is running software designed for a small tribe in a world with infinite social interactions. Every text, every email, every comment. Each one could signal danger. Each one requires evaluation. And your nervous system, designed to track 150 people, is overwhelmed by thousands. So it does what it's designed to do. It shuts down, it withdraws. Not because you're antisocial, but because your brain is trying to protect you from social overload, from the pain of connection that doesn't sustain, from the exhaustion of performing authenticity. And here's the cruelest part. The longer you're isolated, the harder connection becomes. Because isolation itself changes how you perceive social cues. You become hypersensitive to rejection. You interpret neutral expressions as negative. You expect people to leave before they even arrive. It's not your fault. It's biology trying to protect you in a world it wasn't designed for. We live in a world that worships extroversion, networking, social media, constant availability. Your ancestors had 150 people in their entire world. You have thousands in your phone, hundreds online, endless faces, names, profiles, and somehow in all that noise, you're alone. Modern society tells us that friendship should be easy, that if you're likable, connection happens naturally, that if you're struggling, something must be wrong with you. But that's not true. Friendship used to be built through proximity and time. You lived near someone. You saw them daily. Bonds formed slowly through shared experience. Now we're told to make friends through apps, through meetups, through forced conversations with strangers. And when that feels awkward or exhausting or impossible, we blame ourselves. You can be surrounded by thousands of people online and still feel utterly unseen, because attention isn't connection and validation isn't intimacy. Your brain knows the difference. It's not fooled by likes and comments and surface-level interaction. It knows what real connection feels like, and it knows you don't have it. So the loneliness deepens, not because you're failing, but because you're human. And humans weren't designed for this. There's a particular kind of grief in being someone no one truly knows. People see you, they work with you, they're polite, but no one calls just to talk. No one notices when you're struggling. No one asks the deeper questions. And behind the acceptance, behind the "I'm fine with being alone," there's something you don't say. Resentment? Not towards specific people, but toward the world that made connection feel impossible. Toward yourself for not being able to do what seems effortless for everyone else. There's rage buried beneath the loneliness. Rage at having to watch everyone else build lives full of people while you sit on the outside. At being told you're too intense or too quiet or too much or not enough. At trying so hard and still ending up alone. And beneath the rage, something even harder to admit. Shame. Deep, quiet shame that whispers, if you were worth knowing, someone would know you. That if you were lovable, you'd be loved. That the loneliness is proof of some fundamental defect. Not true, not even close. But the shame doesn't care about truth. It just sits there, waiting. Maybe the absence of friends isn't evidence of unworthiness. Maybe it's evidence of discernment. Maybe you're not failing at connection. Maybe you're refusing to settle for connection that costs more than it gives. What if the loneliness isn't punishment? What if it's preparation? Because here's what people don't understand about those who've spent time alone. They've learned something most people never do. They've learned to sit with themselves, to be their own company, to find peace in silence. That's not weakness, that's strength most people will never develop. And yes, it's lonely. Yes, there are nights when the ache feels unbearable. When you wonder if you'll ever find your people. When you scroll through photos of gatherings you weren't invited to and feel the weight of invisibility. But maybe those moments aren't failures. Maybe they're clarifying. Because every time you sit with that loneliness instead of running from it, you're learning something. You're learning what you actually need. Not surface-level pleasantries. Not people who like the version of you that's easy and light. But people who can hold the full weight of who you are. And those people are rare. So maybe the waiting isn't wasted time. Maybe it's discernment. Maybe it's your soul refusing to accept less than it deserves. Because the right people won't require you to shrink. They won't need you to perform. They'll meet you in the depth and feel relieved to finally be there with someone. Perhaps the loneliness taught you to notice things others miss, to value presence over performance, to understand that real connection isn't about how many people show up. It's about who stays when things get real. And when you meet someone who can do that, you'll know. Because you've spent enough time alone to recognize the difference between someone filling space and someone filling your life. Maybe healing doesn't mean suddenly having a dozen friends. Maybe it means releasing the belief that something is wrong with you for not having them. Maybe it means understanding that your nervous system is wired for caution because it learned that connection can hurt. And honoring that, not rushing it, not forcing it, just acknowledging it and moving forward anyway. Because you're not broken for being careful. You're wise. You're protecting something valuable, yourself. And one day, you'll meet someone worth the risk. Someone who doesn't make you feel like you need to translate yourself into something easier to digest. Someone who sees the intensity, the depth, the observation, and doesn't flinch. And when that happens, you'll realize something. The years you spent alone weren't wasted. They were necessary because you needed to learn who you are outside of other people's definitions. You needed to build a relationship with yourself strong enough that connection enhances your life instead of defining it. Not absence, presence. Not emptiness, depth. Not isolation, preparation. So if you're someone who has no friends right now, please understand this. You're not broken. You're not unworthy. You're just in the middle of your becoming. There will still be moments when you feel the ache, when you wonder if something is missing. That's okay. That's not failure. That's being human. But there will also come a day when you sit across from someone who says, "I feel like I've known you forever." And all the years you spent in silence will suddenly make sense. You'll realize that solitude was never punishment. It was preparation. It gave you time to know yourself, to develop interests that matter, to learn what you actually value instead of what you're supposed to value. And when connection finally comes, it won't feel like rescue. It'll feel like recognition, because the right people won't save you from loneliness. They'll meet you in your wholeness and build something together, not from need, from choice. And that kind of friendship, built on depth instead of convenience, is worth the wait. So walk gently with the loneliness. Don't let it convince you that you're defective. Let it teach you what you need. Let it clarify what you won't settle for. Because one day, you'll look back on this time and understand. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of becoming. Maybe that's the truest kind of friendship there is. Not built from constant conversation, but from quiet understanding, from two souls who've both known loneliness and decided together that they won't have to feel it again. Not because they need each other, but because they choose each other. And maybe in the meantime, the loneliness is teaching you something no friend ever could, that you're enough. Even when no one's watching, even when no one's there, that your worth isn't measured by how many people know you, but by how deeply you know yourself. That being alone isn't the same as being lonely. That silence can be peaceful. That solitude can be sacred. Maybe you're not waiting for friends. Maybe you're becoming the kind of person who attracts the right ones. The ones who don't require you to be smaller. The ones who see your depth and feel relieved. Not emptiness, depth, not withdrawal, peace, not absence, presence. You're not broken, you're human. And that's enough.